Under an obsidian sky, the stars of truth shine brighter than they ever could during the light of day. Join our nighttime journey through the mysteries of the soul and the secrets of the universe. Subscribe today and let the darkness reveal the light you've searched for. My grandmother called me on a Thursday in late November and said, "Sweetheart, your mother wants everyone home for Thanksgiving. She says it's important this year." I remember standing in my apartment kitchen, stirring leftover pasta that had gone cold, thinking, important, like it was a board meeting. Like my showing up was an agenda item someone had penciled in. I hadn't been back to my parents' house in 8 months. Not since Easter, when my mother had handed me a Tupperware container of ham and said, "You look tired," in that particular way she had. Like tired was a character flaw, something I'd chosen. I told my grandmother I'd be there. I should have asked more questions. I drove 4 hours on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving. My boyfriend had offered to come with me. He always offered, and I always said no, because bringing him home felt like handing someone a lit match and saying, "Hold this while I go get more kindling." He'd met my family once, at my cousin's wedding 2 years ago. Afterward, in the car ride home, he'd been quiet for almost 40 minutes before he said, "Do they know you at all?" And I hadn't known how to answer that. The house looked the same. My mother had new curtains in the front window, white with little embroidered birds, and there was a wreath on the door that I was certain she'd bought at a craft boutique and told everyone she'd made herself. My grandmother's car was already in the driveway. An old silver Buick she'd been driving since 2009, the kind of car that looked like it was resting rather than parked. Seeing it made something loosen in my chest. Inside, my mother was directing my father like a contractor on a job site. He was carrying a folding table from the garage, navigating the doorframe with the practiced patience of a man who had long ago stopped protesting assignments he didn't ask for. My younger brother was on the couch with his phone, feet up on the coffee table. His fiancée sat beside him, and I could tell from the angle of her shoulders, slightly inward, slightly braced, that she was already having the kind of day I recognized. "You made it," my mother said, without looking up from the centerpiece she was assembling. "Pine cones and ribbon. Go put your things in the guest room. We put Grammy in your old room since the stairs." "Okay. And change, will you? We're taking family photos before dinner." My brother looked up from his phone long enough to smirk at me. We had a whole language, the two of us, built entirely of looks. That one meant, "Welcome back. Nothing has changed. Good luck." I went to find my grandmother. She was sitting by the window in my old room, in the armchair I'd had since I was 12. The room had been repainted since I moved out. Some kind of muted sage that my mother had probably seen in a magazine, and all my things except a framed photo on the dresser that I'm pretty sure was there because someone had forgotten to throw it away, rather than as any kind of sentiment. My grandmother was reading. She had her reading glasses on, the bright red ones she'd bought at a pharmacy and loved more than any object I'd ever seen her own, and she was so absorbed she didn't hear me come in. "Grammy." She looked up, and her face did that thing it always did when she saw me, like the sun coming out from behind something. I know that sounds sentimental. I don't care. It's the only accurate description I have. "There she is," she said. I sat on the edge of the bed, and for a moment we just existed in the same room together, which was its own kind of relief. She was 81. She'd had both hips replaced, and there was some arthritis in her hands that she mentioned only when it was genuinely bad, which meant it was always worse than she let on. She lived alone in the house she'd shared with my grandfather for 43 years before he died. A house in the kind of quiet suburb where people still knew their neighbors' names and brought casseroles when someone had surgery. "How are you really?" I said. Not a question. She knew what I meant. She folded her glasses and set them in her lap. "I'm all right. Your mother's been making a fuss about the stairs, which I've been managing just fine for 30 years. She put you in here so you wouldn't have to climb them. She put me in here so she could say she put me in here," my grandmother said, and then looked like she regretted it, and then decided she didn't. "I'm being uncharitable. It's a nice room." It wasn't a particularly nice room anymore, but we both let that go. Thanksgiving itself was what it always was, my mother forming performance domestic perfection for an audience of people who would have preferred less performance and more dinner. The turkey was good. The gravy was from a jar that she'd poured into her own gravy boat and would deny until her dying day. My brother's fiancé helped clear the dishes, and I helped her, and at one point she caught my eye over the sink and mouthed the words, "How do you survive this?" And I had to pretend I was coughing. My grandmother sat at the head of the table. She always had, even after my grandfather died, even though my mother set the table, and would have clearly preferred to assign seating differently. Some things you just don't rearrange. After dinner, when my father had fallen asleep in front of football and my brother and his fiancée had escaped to the backyard with wine, and the very reasonable excuse of getting some air, I sat with my grandmother at the kitchen table, while my mother loaded the dishwasher, with the focused energy of someone who was annoyed about something and hadn't decided yet how to make it everyone else's problem. "I want to talk to you about something," my grandmother said, quietly, not looking toward my mother. "Okay, not now. Come by the house next weekend, if you can." I said I could, and I meant it, but I also didn't know yet what I was agreeing to. I want to back up because there are things you need to understand about my grandmother to understand what came next. She was not a flashy person. She wore the same style of cardigan in rotating colors, drove the same car for 15 years, bought her groceries at the same store she'd been going to since my mother was in high school. When my grandfather died, she didn't crumble. She took a week, and then she got up, and then she got a part-time job at the library, doing something with cataloging that she described vaguely and loved completely. What I did not fully know, because she had not made a point of telling me, was that my grandfather had been quietly and persistently good with money in a way that compounded over decades. He'd started a small property management company in the mid-1980s, built it slowly, sold it in 2003 for a sum that I would later learn was more significant than anyone in the family had acknowledged out loud. The money had been invested conservatively, and then, later, very well. My grandmother had lived off a fraction of the interest and let the rest grow because, as she would tell me, she didn't need it and didn't see the point of spending money just because you had it. She had also, for the past several years, been watching her children manage their finances and their lives in ways that concerned her. And she had come to some conclusions. I didn't know any of this yet. I just knew she wanted to talk. I drove out to her house the following Saturday. She made coffee and put out a plate of the almond cookies she'd been making since I was small, and we sat at her kitchen table the same way we always had, and for a while we just talked. About my job. I work in physical therapy, which my family treats as a polite way of saying I didn't go to medical school. About her book club. About the neighbor who'd gotten a dog that barked at 5 in the morning, and then she folded her hands on the table and said, "I've been working with my attorney on my estate." I nodded. I didn't know what to say. "I want to be honest with you," she said, "because I think you deserve to know, and because I think knowing might matter for some decisions you make in the next few years." She paused. "Your grandfather left me in a good position. Better than most people know. I've been careful with it, and it's grown. What I have now is," she said a number. I put my coffee cup down. She said it again, calmly, the way she'd say the weather forecast. "Grammy, I know. Does Mom know?" She looked at me for a moment. "Your mother knows there is money. She has some ideas about the amount. She is not correct." I sat with that. "I'm not telling you this to alarm you," she said. "I'm telling you because I've made some decisions about how it will be handled, and I want you to hear it from me. Not later. Not after." What she told me over the next hour rearranged something fundamental about how I understood my own life. My grandmother had 3 children: my mother, my uncle, who lives in Phoenix, and my aunt, who'd passed away 11 years ago and left behind 2 kids who my grandmother had quietly helped support through college and beyond. Anzeled. She had watched my mother spend money she didn't have on things she didn't need, and then look toward my grandmother's house the way certain people look at things they're already measuring for themselves. She had watched my uncle do something similar, more loudly, from a greater geographic distance. She had watched me work double shifts during graduate school and not ask anyone for help because I'd internalized very early that asking for help in my family came with conditions. "I've left your mother and your uncle each a portion," she said, "enough to be meaningful, enough to be fair." She named the amount. It was not small. "And the rest?" I asked. She looked at me in that steady way she had. "The rest goes into a trust, for you, and for your cousins, Aunt Patricia's kids, split between you 3. I didn't cry. I want to be clear about that, because the moment almost demanded it, and I just sat there, very still, like I was afraid that moving would break something. "Grammy, that's... You don't have to. I know I don't have to." She said it gently but firmly, the way she always shut down sentences that started with "you don't have to." "I want to. There's a difference." She told me she'd already spoken with her attorney, that the documents were in order, that she wasn't telling me this to burden me or to create conflict, but because she'd spent her whole life watching people find out things like this after the fact and have no time to process them, and she thought I deserved to know, while she was still here, to explain it herself. "There's one thing I want from you," she said. "Anything. Keep living your life the way you're living it. Don't wait for this. Don't arrange your life around this. I've watched people do that. Start waiting, and it's a terrible way to spend your years." I drove home that afternoon in a kind of stunned quiet that felt nothing like sadness and nothing like happiness, just the particular vertigo of finding out that someone has been loving you in ways you didn't know about for longer than you knew. I told my boyfriend that night. He sat on the other end of the couch and listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "She's remarkable." "I know. Does your mom know she told you?" "No," he nodded slowly. "Okay, do you want to tell her?" And I thought about that for a long time before I said no. I don't think I do. Winter passed. Christmas, my mother wanted everyone at the house again, and I went, because my grandmother would be there, and I wanted to be where she was. My brother had his holiday thing with his fiancé's family, and my uncle flew in from Phoenix with his wife, and managed to be loudly generous with the wine, while saying nothing meaningful to anyone. At some point, on Christmas Eve, my uncle cornered me in the hallway near the guest bathroom and said, "You know, I've been thinking about approaching your grandmother about the house. Just a conversation. See if she'd consider selling it while she's still, while it's easy." I said, "I didn't know you were interested in the house." "I'm not interested in the house," he said, and laughed in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "I just think it might be easier for her not to manage it alone. You know how these things go." I said, "I'll leave that conversation to you," and went back to the living room. Later, I sat next to my grandmother on the couch while my uncle was telling a story about a golf trip, and she leaned over and said, very quietly, "He asked me about the house." "I know. He mentioned it." She made a small sound, not quite a sigh, that held a lot of information. "What did you say?" I said, "The house isn't going anywhere while I'm in it." She patted my hand. "Don't worry about it. My grandmother died in April." It wasn't sudden in the way that word implies a surprise, but it was still a week from fine to not fine, which felt sudden enough. She'd had a quiet cardiac event one morning that she apparently walked off long enough to call her neighbor to water her plants before she called anyone in the family, which was so completely her that it broke my heart a little every time I thought about it. I was with her at the end. My mother was there, and my uncle had flown in, and we sat in the hospital room, in the particular silence of people who are in the same grief but not quite sharing it. She didn't make any speeches. She just held my hand for a long time, and at one point she said, "The almond cookies. The recipe's in the blue binder. Second shelf. I'll find it," I said. "Good." The attorney called 6 days after the funeral. My mother and uncle were both there. I had been asked to come, which surprised me, and I think surprised them too, though they arranged their faces in ways that suggested they had theories about why. My mother had spent the post-funeral week in a state of efficient grief that involved a lot of organizational tasks and very little sitting still. My uncle had extended his stay from 3 days to the whole week, which told me something. The attorney was a woman in her 60s, calm and precise, the kind of person who had delivered news like this many times, and understood that her job was to be clear, not theatrical. She read through the preliminary portions, the directives, the personal bequests, the specific items that went to specific people, the china set that went to my aunt's daughter, the Buick that my grandmother had left to her neighbor across the street, because apparently they'd had a conversation about it years ago. Then she got to the financial distribution. My mother and uncle each received a portion, meaningful, fair. The attorney had said it in a way that was both of those things, and then she described the trust. My mother's expression shifted so slowly and so completely that I had the strange experience of watching someone's understanding of a situation change in real time. She looked at the paper. She looked at me. She looked back at the paper. My uncle said, "Can you repeat that?" The attorney repeated it. "And the trust is," my uncle started, "split between 3 beneficiaries," the attorney said. "In equal thirds. The names are specified in the document. My cousins, my aunt's kids, the ones my grandmother had helped through school, were the other 2. I knew their names on that list would mean something different to my uncle than they meant to me, but I also knew that my grandmother had known exactly what she was doing when she put them there, and why. My mother turned to me. "Did you know about this?" I thought about the kitchen table, the almond cookies, the number she'd said like a weather forecast. "She told me she was working on her estate," I said. "She wanted me to know she'd thought it through." My mother was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that the attorney offered water, which my mother declined. My uncle said something about contesting, and the attorney explained, patiently and without effect, that the documents had been prepared and executed over a period of 18 months with full legal review, and that my grandmother had been, at every step, entirely and demonstrably of sound mind. That was the end of that conversation. There are things I want to say about what came after, and things I'm not sure I'm ready to say yet. My mother and I didn't speak for about 6 weeks. Not because of a dramatic confrontation. There was no screaming, no ultimatums, nothing that would make for a clean story. Just a kind of withdrawal on both sides, a settling into the shape of things. When we did talk again, it was because she called me on a Sunday morning and said, without preamble, "I want you to know I don't blame you," which was interesting because it implied there was something to blame me for. I said, "Okay." She made her choices, my mother said, and I made mine. I suppose she saw something in you that she wanted to recognize. I didn't know exactly what that meant or how to respond to it, so I said, "She loved you. I know she did. She talked about you." My mother made a sound that might have been the beginning of something, and then wasn't. "We talk now. Not often, but we talk. It's not the same as it was, but I'm not sure it was ever what I thought it was, so maybe that's okay. Maybe what we're building now is more honest than what we had before." My uncle went back to Phoenix. We don't really talk. My cousins and I have become closer than we've ever been, which is maybe the most surprising outcome of all of this, and the one my grandmother would have been most pleased about. I found the blue binder on the second shelf. The almond cookie recipe was there, in her handwriting, on an index card she'd tucked between a page about pie crusts and a page about things you can do with leftover turkey. The measurements were all in her particular shorthand. A dash of this. Enough of that, and it took me 3 attempts before I made them the way I remembered them tasting. The third batch was close enough that I sat down at my kitchen table and ate 4 of them and let myself cry, finally, in the way I hadn't been able to at the hospital, or at the funeral, or in the attorney's office. Not from sadness exactly, or not only from that. From the specific ache of being known, of having someone see you clearly over decades, through all the noise of a family, being imperfect in the ways families are, and choosing to say, you. Choosing to make sure you knew, while they were still here to tell you. I keep the recipe card on my refrigerator now, held up with a magnet she gave me years ago. A small ceramic thing, shaped like a hummingbird that she'd bought at a craft fair, and said reminded her of me, because I was always moving, but always came back to the same place. I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I think I do now.